Hey everyone, Coach Mike here, and welcome back to another episode of the Language of Leadership. Thrilled today to be joined by Cynthia Owyoung, CEO of Breaking Glass Forums, senior executive at Robinhood, and author of All Are Welcome: How to Build a Real Workplace Culture of Inclusion That Delivers Results. Cynthia, how are you doing today?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me, Mike. It's a pleasure to talk to you today.
Thrilled to be here with you today, Cynthia, to learn from your experience and to hear you be able to share with our community about not only your work and opinions and diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, but also your leadership journey and the lessons you've learned. Before we jump into that, would it be possible just to share a brief background of yourself and your journey with our viewers and audience so that they can get to know you better?
Sure thing. So, first off, I'm based in the San Francisco Bay Area in California, in the United States. I was born and raised here. My parents actually immigrated from China, so I'm first generation born here. Native San Franciscan, grew up here, have deep ties to the area as a result of that. So I went to school here at UC Berkeley, and then started a career in advertising, where I actually did consumer research and strategic branding for different ad agencies. Did that for about a decade or so before I decided to make a career switch. I went to grad school at UC Los Angeles, decided to switch over to HR and diversity management specifically, which is what started me down this particular career path in this field for the last 20 years. I've had the good fortune to work at different tech companies, both smaller startups like GitHub to large global companies like Yahoo, um, before switching over into financial services, where I worked at Charles Schwab for a little bit, all the while leading, building diversity, equity, inclusion strategies, teams, and initiatives at every place that I've been to. Before I landed here at Robinhood, and I've been here for the past year and a half.
Well, Cynthia, you've seen more of a change in the world of diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging than I think most people can imagine. I know you were a senior executive in charge of diversity at Yahoo before most people even knew that there was such a role. Would it be possible for you to share with us how did you have so much foresight to get into this field so early on? And then what are some of the biggest changes that you've seen over the years that you've been a professional in this area?
Great question, Mike. I would say foresight is probably too generous of a word for me in terms of how I got into this field. It wasn't something that I thought, oh, this at some point this field is going to be sort of the global phenomenon that it has become. For me, at the time that I was thinking about this as a career option in grad school, it was sort of the confluence of a few different things that caused me to really devote my career to this, like to really enter the field. One is just family background, right? I mentioned I'm a first generation American born Chinese, but I also have a brother who is developmentally disabled. I have another brother who is gay. I myself am, a woman, growing up feeling very bicultural in a lot of ways because my parents came from a much more sort of traditional Chinese cultural mindset. And then, which was at odds at a lot of times with sort of this American kind of cultural mindset. And so navigating that always felt like I had one foot in two worlds, you know. And so, all of these experiences, especially growing up and seeing people treat my developmentally disabled brother very differently based on, his, social awkwardness, right? He has a speech impediment, so it makes him difficult to understand. People would just automatically assume he was like not smart, right? And while he does have some disability from a learning perspective, it doesn't mean he can't learn. And so, seeing things like those biases kind of play out in real time in my everyday life really made me think, okay, these are things I want to correct for. And my brother, when I was in grad school, he lost his job that he'd held down for 13 years, and I had to find him another one. And it was really, really difficult. So that experience combined with actually taking a course in grad school called diversity management, which was really like cutting edge, right, at the time, where I heard from somebody who actually had this kind of role at a major corporation about what her career was like. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's when the light bulb came off. And I thought, that's something that I could do, right? I could help people like my brother open doors to employment, open doors to opportunity and advancement inside companies, and do what I could to reduce whatever barriers might exist to including people from different backgrounds. And so that's when I decided I was going to go into this field. um, but my timing wasn't great. So I graduated from grad school during the first tech bust back in the early 2000s. And if anyone, if you were around at that time, you know that it was a time when companies stopped all hiring. They were rescinding offers from, graduates for jobs. There was a lot of contraction going on. And so finding a role in this space was actually really difficult because, as you said, it's a nascent sort of field at that time. Not a lot of companies actually had this as a function. For the most part, it was seen as like compliance, like government regulations around diversity and representation that companies had to fulfill, and not necessarily the innovation engine that companies are now seeing it as today, right? So, I ended up, networking my way, doing a lot of gigs and contracts and short-term freelancing roles to be able to finally get myself in the door to this kind of a role, where it was more than compliance. It was more about how do we help provide more access to opportunity for people.
Thank you, Cynthia. I want to dive a little bit deeper into something you just mentioned there, which is how the roles of diversity, inclusion, equity, belonging may have originally been seen as compliance, but now they're seen as a strategic advantage and, dare I even say, a strategic imperative for many companies. Um, I can understand that there's probably a baseline foundational argument, which is many of the leaders of these companies historically have been white men from similar sort of social or academic settings. Maybe they all went to XYZ school or they all worked at ABC firm. Why do you think that diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging wasn't already a much more prevalent field, considering that we as humans, the concept of diversity hasn't changed so much, but why has it really exploded into the public eye in the last decade or so, and then of course in the last 24, 36 months with recent events in the United States and elsewhere?
I think that, I mean, it's a lot of different things have contributed to that. I think over time we've seen that not a lot of progress has been made in this space, and so because of that, you have a real steep rise in employee activism in this space, right? And so employees, people in general coming into the workforce, they're growing up with more diversity around them, and then they're getting into these companies and not seeing it reflected back, and they're naturally questioning why, right? And so I think that that's sort of just the natural progression of sort of society's kind of general awareness around diversity and who's in the in groups and who's not necessarily, and who's in the out groups, right? And then I think the second thing that has happened is that over time you've also seen a lot more rigorous research being done that actually creates linkages between diversity and inclusion, driving like creativity and innovation and better decision making on teams. And so businesses started to realize that if they had more diversity, they would actually produce better business outcomes for them. Where you see studies from, you know, these big consulting firms like McKinsey proving year over year this like relationship between more diverse leadership teams and better financial metrics at their companies, right? So that's where you start to see that idea of this being DEI being a strategic imperative for companies start to kind of take hold as a driver for business success because it drives innovation and decisions. And then I think, you know, as particularly you mentioned the last 36 months, right? You know, in 2020, and actually prior to 2020, especially here in the US particularly, we've had, with the rise of social media and technology and connectedness around the world, it's so much easier for stories of inequity and social injustice to spread. And so people get much more visceral moments around, you know, the events in Ferguson, right, where we had riots, right, and you know, and every kind of trial case where it felt like, you know, unarmed Black people were being targeted, right, in the streets or by police or what have you, to the point where it culminated, right, with the pandemic and the murder of George Floyd, which actually reverberated globally within days, right? And so you have this like huge almost tide of awareness that happened because it's been enabled by technology that has really sort of put it, you know, I mean, in a place where you can't ignore it any longer. And I think that's why you see so many companies, you know, globally really thinking about, okay, what am I doing in this space? What role does my company play? What are my employees like? What do they care about? And what are they asking for? And how do we meet that moment in time?
Perhaps we can dive a little bit deeper in that area, which is some of the biggest lessons that you've learned over the course of your career. I know that you've had the opportunity to work in incredibly different and diverse environments, both as you mentioned, smaller firms in, you know, multinational billion-dollar companies. You've worked in the world of marketing and advertising. You've worked in the world of technology and now financial services or financial technology, excuse me. What would be one or two of your biggest lessons learned over the course of your career that you might impart to a young adult looking to begin their career today?
Mm, I think there are two good ones that I can share. One is that your decisions don't always write the rest of your future the way that we might think it does when we're younger, right? When I was younger, I thought advertising was going to be the career for me, and that was it. You know, I was going to be a marketing executive or a CEO by the time I was 30 years old. That didn't come to pass. But I remember thinking to myself when I felt like I wasn't getting to that milestone that I thought I had set out for myself, like what did I do wrong? You know? And what I realize now after having another career and another couple decades under my belt is it's not about doing anything wrong, right? It's about understanding, you know, that change happens and that's okay. You know, it's sometimes okay not to reach whatever dream or vision or goal that you might have had when you were really young, if that's been replaced by an even better one, right? That is more, you know, that does more for you from a whole human perspective than just your career necessarily. And I say that, you know, now having to balance things like family, both my kids as well as my parents, who are much more elderly now, right? With a career as a senior executive, with friends and hobbies and all of the things that I think make life whole for me. The second thing I would say is also related to this, which is change is good. I think a lot of people feel like can be bad. Like if we're in our comfort zones and our habits, we don't like to be taken out of those because it's uncomfortable, and who likes feeling uncomfortable, right? But with every change I've seen in my career in particular, I've always tried to look at it as like, what's the opportunity within that change, right? So if a company is going through a downturn and maybe you lose your job, right? Okay, what's the next thing going to be? If I am, going after a promotion and I don't get it, okay, well, why didn't I get it? What feedback do you have for me, and how can I be better? Right. So I always look at change as an opportunity to either learn, pivot, do something new, right? Grow in some way, shape, or form. And I think that served me pretty well over my career.
With that last one, Cynthia, maybe I can just ask from the perspective of a young adult. Let's say I'm getting ready to start my first internship, or I'm getting ready to start my career. It seems as though through your career journey, you almost over time got back in touch, or gotten closer touch with who you were and your family in this sort of beautiful second act of your career. I'm wondering, how, as a young adult about to begin my career or begin our career, can I get in touch with what really matters to me? Do you have any questions we can ask ourselves, or resources that we can think about to figure out what really matters to me, and where should I go to start that journey?
That is a deep question, Mike. I think that um, you know, when I was younger, I used to always make lists, right? So I would do lists of pros and cons for like everything. And so, when I think about like the job that I'm trying to go after, or like the college that I'm trying to get into, or whatever big decision was in front of me, I always encourage people to sort of make their lists of pros and cons. And to your point, like, what is it that you care about, right? And what's kind of like your priority in evaluating that next step, or whatever that major decision might be for you. And if you're you need to get clear on what really matters to you. And I think I would always get feedback on some of that too, right? I think sometimes we look through only one lens when we think about like our own futures, but it's important to get other people's viewpoints of your strengths, right? And as well as sort of what it's like to actually go down that path. An example that I'll give you is, at one point, I thought I would go into nonprofit management. And um, when I was like taking classes on this, I also thought, well, maybe I should ask people who are actually running nonprofits what that's like. Right. And, in the course of asking and talking to all these people who are actually doing it, like I got a huge amount of insight as to what their day to day was like, what that, how they balance, the needs of the organizations with the needs of their clients, with the needs of like their families, and all of those things. And it really, the key thing that I got from that was that, what? All nonprofits need business people who have business acumen to help run them effectively. And the world of nonprofit is always going to be there whenever I'm ready for it. And maybe right now I wasn't necessarily ready for it when I was thinking about it. And so people would tell me, go get your business acumen, go like build your networks, do what you need to do, and then come back to it when you're ready. And that was like a really good learning process for me, right? So I think again, like just going out, talking to people who are doing the things that you're thinking about doing, getting really good understanding of what trade-offs they make, and what is required to do whatever that role is really well. I think is really important for you to be able to compare on your lists, right, of what's important to you. And then I use that to help guide my decision making in this space.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Cynthia.
Take care. Thank
Take
you.
care. Bye bye.